All right, we're going to get started. Welcome back, everybody, to Notch 8 Photography. This is our second photo slideshow. And like I said last time, I like to try to do this once or twice a month, and each one has a theme. So this time around, we are doing fall foliage trains. As you see here, it's titled Steel, Steam, and Falling Leaves. We'll be focusing primarily on the fall foliage steam trains, but we're going to start off with, hold on a sec. We're going to start off with some diesel engines. Now, yesterday, my dad and I took a trip down to the New Jersey Transit's Pascagoula Valley line. We had gotten word that this Conrail painted locomotive was in passenger service that day. Now, these locomotives don't normally look like this. They usually are silver and they have the New Jersey Transit lettering and they have the disco stripe logo on the side of it. But they have five of these locomotives painted in the schemes of predecessor railroads. Number 4208 here is painted for Conrail, and that was painted October of last year, and it's been in service since December, December of 2024. They had to do some work on it before they could officially release it into passenger service. But here it is in Westwood, New Jersey. You can see on the far left, there's the Westwood sign. Note the red lights on the front. That means that the locomotive is pushing south to Hoboken. If it was pulling the train north to Spring Valley, those lights wouldn't be on. The two lights up below the horn would be on. And from there, we went down to Croton, New York. This is at the Croton Harmon shops for the Metro North Railroad. And what you see here is one of their newest locomotives. For the past 20 or 30 years, they've been using these locomotives, like the one you see here, number 208, but they're reaching the ends of their shelf life. So the locomotive in the previous slide is what's going to replace the locomotive in this slide ultimately. Number 208 is another one of those locomotives that's decorated for a predecessor. And then we headed to the park just up the road, and we arrived there in time to see ConnDOT, Connecticut Department of Transportation's locomotive number 230 pushing south to Grand Central Terminal. This is the Hudson line. It goes north to Poughkeepsie and south to Grand Central Terminal. It's shared by ConnDOT and Metro North, and this is one of ConnDOT's locomotives. They have four of these Class P32 passenger locomotives, and they're all painted in the scheme of the New Haven Railroad, which was their predecessor railroad. And just a few moments later, Metro North's Conrail locomotive came pulling a train north to Poughkeepsie. Now, you may be wondering why number 201 here has a yellow nose and number 4208 does not. Before Metro North and Jersey Transit, Conrail was operating the passenger trains on the Hudson River line and the Pascagoula Valley lines. They had a set of Class FL9 passenger diesels, and they were all painted in the Conrail blue, but they had these yellow noses. Those were the only Conrail locomotives that had them, to my knowledge. So this P32 was decorated to mimic the FL9s that ran on Conrail. And here's a run-of-the-mill Metro North Railroad engine. This kind of snuck up on my father and I, so we didn't really expect this train. And from there, my dad and I were a little bit daring, and we found out that 4208 was coming back up from Hoboken, so we got ahead of it and we beat it to Montvale, New Jersey. So here it is pulling in. Interesting thing about the 4208, it was an original Conrail locomotive. It was originally owned and operated by Conrail, and then it was given to New Jersey Transit in the early 90s to expand its passenger fleet. So it was rebuilt and it was painted in the Jersey Transit livery, which was the silver with the chevron logo. All right, we're going to turn the clocks back to the year 2023. This is a cold night in anthracite. This was a commemorative night photo session that I coordinated with Steve Barry and the volunteers of Railway Restoration Project 113 to celebrate the 100th birthday of steam locomotive number 113. Now, number 113 was originally built for the Central Railroad of New Jersey, or the CNJ. It ran for the CNJ until either the late 40s or the early 50s. I can't remember which. And then it was given to a coaling company, which used it up until, I think, 1960. It changed owners a bunch of times before it wound up in Minersville under the care of Bob Kimmel Jr. And for a number of years, he had a volunteer workforce come in and restore the locomotive to operation. And in partnership with the Reading and Northern Railroad, he would use the locomotive to run excursion trains out of the historic Minersville station. Here's a couple of scenes we staged at the station. You could see some of the volunteers in the background. We had my friend get up on the footboard there and swing a lantern. Then this guy came out. He originally came out with an arc welder, but that was giving off way too much light. So we had him use a grinder instead, and we just told him just make some sparks, and he did not disappoint, as you can see here. Then we brought on some coal miners and passengers on the station platform, and we staged them with the 113. Looks like a scene out of a movie, if you ask me. And they also, the Railway Project 113 also owns that passenger car you see in the background. That's CNJ number 98, another piece of rolling stock that came from the Jersey Central. And then they did a couple of scenes inside the station. This was the only one that I shot. Now that map that that woman is looking up at is a map of the Reading and Northern Railroad's system. They expanded. They started operations in 1983 and they expanded in 1991. And they're still expanding their operation. They're a regional railroad, but they're not going to be as big as railroads like Norfolk Southern or CSX. That's just how it is. And they serve the northeastern regions of Pennsylvania. I made the scene black and white. And there's a couple more volunteers. They were oiling some of the rods and whatnot on the 113. And then we come back to the scene with everybody posed in front of the engine at night. The next morning, I was on my way back home from Minersville. I stayed in Ranshaw, about 20 minutes up the road. And on the way back home, I stopped in Port Clinton because the Reading and Northern had their 40th anniversary locomotive sitting at the engine terminal. And like I said, they started off in 1983, and this is what their locomotives used to look like. If you look in the background towards the far right, you'll see a green locomotive, and that's their current livery. Most of what they have now is painted in that green with the gold lettering. Excuse me. And that's their old logo. They used to be called the Blue Mountain Reading. Interesting note about the color. It's not purple. It's a very deep shade of blue that they call Blue Mountain Blue. But to most people, myself included, it looks purple. So we kind of call it the Purple People Eater. All right, we're gonna flash forward to 2024 and 2025 for this next one. This is the Roaring 2102's Fall Ventures. We're sticking around with the Reading and Northern for this one. Every year they have this giant of a locomotive pull their fall foliage excursion trains. This is number 2102. It was originally built for the Reading, so it's it has some local history to it. Well, it has some relevance to the region. Number 2102 was restored to operation in 2022, and it's been in service ever since. So you could actually ride this train from Reading to Jim Thorpe, but occasionally they also have trains pulled by the 2102 that come out of Nesquehoning and Pittston. So here's the locomotive just idling at Reading Outer Station. That's where it usually runs out of. The previous two shots were taken in 2024 when I went out for it. This year I went out once and I only did two spots. So this was one of the two spots I did. This was crossing under the roadway heading into Port Clinton. Would have been helpful if it was cloudy because you have the top all lit up and now the locomotive's in shadows, but you got to take what you can get. I can't remember if this is up the line or if it's before Port Clinton, but this is one of those photo locations that's secluded. You kind of have to go out of your way for it. And I tried this last year. This is called Black Oak Curve. And if you look closely, that's actually an S curve that the locomotive's coming off of. So I don't have the words to explain it now, but you kind of have to see it to get it. Here's another shot from this year. This was East Mahonoi Junction. And then back in 2024, we're at Lake Hotto. And at this point, the locomotive's not really working that hard. They usually coast by Hotto. They don't really put on much of a show there, but most of the line, they're working the engine like crazy. And it's very loud too. And here's the 2102 parallel to the lake. Side note, I do think the foliage last year was a little bit better than it is this year. I don't think my photos would show it, but a lot of people this year have been saying that the foliage wasn't as good. And then a week later, I did the return trip from Jim Thorpe to Reading. The last couple of shots were the southbound trip from Reading to Jim Thorpe, and now this is the northbound trip, Reading Jim Thorpe to Reading rather. And this is in Nesquehoning. What you do is you ride the train from Reading to Jim Thorpe, and there's a 3 to 4 hour layover in Jim Thorpe, and then you come back in the evening. So you can see the difference in the daylight there. Further up the tracks at Church Road, you can see he's blowing the whistle for the crossing. And here's the open field shot at Molino. This is another one of those shots that the locomotive's in shadows and the rest of the landscape is in the sunlight. And that's because the sun got too low before the train got a chance to get to us. Mind you, this was the last week of October, so that's when the daylight really starts to change. And then daylight savings happens, so generally it gets tougher for photographers like me to get nicely lit shots, but it's possible. It's just more of a challenge. And there's the 2102 going off into the sunset. And this is where we roll our credits because we're done with the slideshow. I'm just kidding. There's more. Here's the 2102 after it arrived at Outer Station. We got a night exposure of the locomotive idling. Now, further up that line is actually Norfolk Southern. Norfolk Southern's Reading line is like right there. And I believe that may or may not be an interchange point between Reading and Northern and Norfolk Southern. Of course, I had to give this the black and white treatment. I like to give night photos the black and white treatment. I just feel like they're the best kind of photos to do that with. And this is the not so straight but narrow path. This is the East Broad Top Railroad. Last fall, the day after I did my first day with the 2102, I wanted to get out to the East Broad Top Railroad because I saw from videos and photos that the East Broad Top is a beautiful railroad to photograph in the fall. But before I arrived at the East Broad Top, I made a quick stop in Marysville, Pennsylvania. This is the Rockville Bridge. It's the longest stone arch bridge, and it connects Marysville to Rockville and Harrisburg, and that is a former Pennsylvania Railroad bridge that is still used by Norfolk Southern. I pulled over because I saw this impressive fog going over the bridge. Well, I also had to get gas, so I kind of took advantage of the situation. Like, while I'm here, and then here's the East Broad Top. It's their only operational steam locomotive, number 16, but they have one that's under restoration and one that's on deck for restoration. The coolest thing about the East Broad Top that I forgot to mention is that unlike the Reading and Northern, which is a 4 foot by 8.5 gauge, the tracks are 3 foot gauge, so this is a narrow gauge railroad. I believe it's the only narrow gauge railroad that's in service on the East Coast. And most of everything there is original, including the steam locomotives. The East Broad Top had a bunch of these small steam locomotives numbered 12 through 17. I'm sorry, 12 through 18, but they skipped 13 because on the railroad you never order a locomotive number 13. But 16 was the first to be restored to operation under the new management. The East Broad Top closed down in 2011 and it was dormant for many years. But then in 2020 it was bought by a private owner and now the East Broad Top Foundation, I forget the exact name, but the EBT Foundation, I think it is, purchased the railroad and they restored it to working order. So here's number 16 speeding past an old sign that's been there for a while. And then here's a wide shot of the train approaching Colgate Grove, which is where they let kids and families off for the pumpkin patch. And then they turn around and head back to Rock Hill Furnace, Orbisonia Station. The best thing about the East Broad Top is that the roadway parallels the line, so it's pretty easy to race the train and get good shots. Although it's a very short route, it's usually about a 4 mile ride. And then here's number 16 coming back on the return trip. And then 16 in between runs. And then off he goes rather, on the second train that I shot during the day. I corrected myself there because number 16 actually has a name. They named him Nick. Originally, the East Broad Top Railroad was in danger of scrap in the 1960s after its time had come and gone. But the scrap dealer, Nick Kowalczyk, actually saved the railroad and ultimately helped it become this tourist attraction. Unfortunately, Nick Kowalczyk died some years ago, but when the new management took over, they renamed number 16 in his honor. And here comes the black and white. Backlit shots and night shots, I find, are very good for black and white filters like this. Looks like a scene out of the 50s, minus the modern cars in the back. I'm sure Photoshop can take care of that. And here's one of my favorite shots from the day. There's an old barn house parallel to the roadway, and you get a nice shot of the 16 going between the barn house and the trees. And of course, the fall foliage in the background. And here's Nick coming back with the return trip. Now, most railroads would actually, there's no turnaround facility on most railroad lines. So you would see the locomotive detach from the train and get coupled to the rear of the train. He'd come back with his rear end facing first. But on the East Broadtop Railroad, there are two sets of tracks on either ends of the line where the train can essentially make a three-point turn. So he'll always be facing head first. They call those tracks a Y. And here's number 16 going between an orange and red tree. It's another one of my favorites from that trip. And here he is coming into Orbisonia, or approaching Orbisonia Station. Here's the train backing up on that three-point turn I was telling you guys about on the Y. If you look closely in the lower left-hand corner, you could see how thin the tracks are versus standard gauge, which again is 4 foot by 8.5 inches. But this is a 3 foot gauge railroad. And there's 16 backing down the Y. I also took, I think it was the 1 o'clock shop tour, but I took the shop tour and they take you into the roundhouse here where they keep all the steam engines. That track in the middle is the turntable, and they actually spin the locomotives to get them on the right track. And if I'm not mistaken, that turntable is actually man-powered, so they got a few men actually push the turntable so that the locomotive can get positioned on the right track. Most of the modern turntables that you see at museums or rarely in the rail yards of Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, CSX are all electric or gas powered, but this one's man powered. I believe they call that an Armstrong turntable for obvious reasons. And then inside the roundhouse with some of the other locomotives. That's number 18. That is the East Broadtop's largest of their steam locomotives. And off in the distance there is number 17. Both of them are out of service and require very expensive overhauls to be made operational again. And here's the machine shop. Some of the tools that they use to fix up these steam locomotives and to machine new pieces. There's a wheel lathe, which is used to reprofile the wheels whenever they went bad. Because these machines and these wheels wear down so easily after continuous use. So they'd have to bring them in and recondition or replace them. But they'd use machines like the wheel lathe to recondition them for another couple months, couple years worth of use. And here's number 14. Like I said, the East Broad Top has 6 steam locomotives numbered 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. The railroad did not order a number 13 because, well, they're not superstitious, so I'm not going to throw them under the bus. But anyway, number 14 is one of the 2 locomotives that is under restoration for operation. Well, they're restoring number 14 and number 15 to operational status. When the railroad first opened, to my knowledge, in 2020, their intention was to originally have number 14 and number 16 be the first 2 to operate. Number 14 required more work than they originally thought, so now 15 is the next locomotive that's expected to be restored to operation, and then number 14 will get her turn. But they made some progress on the rebuild, as you see here. And you really don't get to see a locomotive dismantled like this. Now, part of a restoration on a steam locomotive is the inspection of the boiler. So if you look on the right side, you'll see a grid chalked out on the boiler. Now, what they do is in each square of that grid, they use an ultrasonic tool to test the thickness of the boiler. It's very important, it's imperative even to make sure that the boiler is thick enough to handle steam pressure. Otherwise, if it can't hold pressure, you're essentially playing with a bomb on wheels. All right, we're on our last subject of the night. Last week, I went to Virginia. I went to Goshen, Virginia, to the Buckingham Branch Railroad. This year, they were hosting the Norfolk and Western 611 steam locomotive, which is a famous streamlines locomotive, as you could tell from its appearance. Number 611 is probably one of the most modern steam locomotives that operates today. It was built in 1950, and the reason it looks like that is because during the last days of steam power in the United States, the railroads tried to modernize their look by streamlining them because the diesels were all sleek, nice, and new, and the steam engines were all dirty and mechanical, and you saw the moving parts and they were all greasy and whatnot. So locomotives like the 611 here were streamlined to enhance their appearance. I believe some of that streamlining also enhanced their aerodynamics when it came to speed. But here's the 611 approaching Hunter's Crossing Road. One of the coolest things about this line is the fact that the steam locomotive can actually accelerate to 40 miles an hour, which is something that most railroads don't do. Whether it's the length of the line or the track conditions, not a lot of railroads can do that with their locomotives, but this is an active main line that's operated by the Buckingham Branch Railroad, which is a freight railroad in Virginia. It's also shared by CSX Transportation, one of the major freight carriers here on the East Coast, and Amtrak also runs on the Buckingham Branch. Getting closer now. This was my favorite shot of the entire trip. I raced the train up to the Jackson Trail in Farrell, Virginia, and I got him coming up the tracks with some good foliage. And he was really working hard up that hill. And there he is rounding the bend. And then I went further up the line to the Hebron Presbyterian Church, and I wanted to get this landscape here. I saw another photographer do this, so I wanted to try this for myself. I like getting wide shots and I like getting landmarks like churches and whatnot in a picture. I don't generally like shooting just the train anymore. I like to have something that gives a sense of location. You can see there's also a cemetery there. It's actually not the first time I shot the 611 at a cemetery. 3 years ago, the Virginia Museum of Transportation, the people who own and operate the 611, they brought it up to the Strasburg Railroad in Lancaster for a visit. And I attended a photo session where we staged scenes with the 611 on the Strasburg Railroad's 4.5-mile line. And one of those scenes took place at an old cemetery, so I got 611 passing through there. But anyway, I digress. Let's move on. Here's the going away shot. That car behind the 611, well, the second car behind 611 is actually for extra water. The car directly behind the 611 locomotive is actually its fuel car. It's called a tender. It stores all the coal and water, but when it does extended runs like this, it may need extra water. So rather than stop the engine for more water, they have another they have another tender there just for water. Now, unlike the East Broad Top, the Buckingham Branch didn't have a Y to turn the 611 and its train around, so they actually had these two diesel locomotives at the rear of the train. And at the end of the run, once it reached Stanton, Virginia, the diesels would take over and pull the train back to Goshen. This was actually them pulling the train back to Goshen. Another rail fan allowed me the opportunity to get a picture of his truck next to the 611. He was doing the same thing. A bunch of us were trying to park to get a spot to shoot the train, and he asked me to move my car since he was trying to get a picture of his truck. So I said no problem, and I just asked if it was okay if I could get that same shot, and he said yeah. I don't remember the exact year, but that's a 90s Ford. And then here's the return trip pulling into Goshen. Now, after they pull into Goshen, there's actually a siding track that they pull into, and they pull all the way back. And then the actual station is on a different line. So they switch tracks, go onto the correct line, and they pull headfirst into what is called Victoria Station. So that's them doing it right there. And in between runs, CSX Transportation sent a grain train through the Goshen depot there. If you look closely, you could see the engineer waving at us. And now here's the second train that we shot during the day. The Buckingham Branch not shot, but they ran two trains per day when they did the Shenandoah Valley Limited, which is the excursion that you see, the name of the excursion train that you see here. The lighting wasn't ideal, so I found that black and white filters actually enhanced the look of these shots. Here's further up the line at Augusta Springs rather. One of the more colorful pictures in my collection. Rounding the bend at Scott Christian Road. And entering Stanton. Stanton, Virginia is actually, an actual passenger station, and I got this shot from the pedestrian walkway. There's a walkway that goes right over the tracks, and there was a bunch of us there with our cameras. And that station is shared between the Virginia Scenic Railroad, which is a subsidiary of the Buckingham Branch Railroad, and Amtrak. And then here's the 611 entering Victoria Station after its second run. This was towards the end of the night. And here's a couple of night shots after they were done for the day. That man is actually standing by the firebox of the steam locomotive, and what he's doing is he's actually cleaning the ash pan. Now, when you have a steam locomotive and you shovel a lot of coal into it, naturally you give off a lot of ash, and that falls in a pan that's located beneath the firebox. If you let that ash accumulate, you're going to have some problems, so you have to clean that out regularly. So that's what this man is doing here. Of course, I always love doing this shot. I love getting a shot of the locomotive's drive rods and whatnot. couple of long exposures. Now, when you do a long exposure like this, any and all movement will blur. So the steam and the smoke look like a painting, or they look painted rather. And at the end of the night, they were filling up the tender with more coal before the next morning. So they went back and forth with that little excavator thingy a couple times before they filled up the tender. Took them about a half hour to do that. So just putting into perspective how much fuel this thing takes on. And I found this shot worked better in black and looked better in black and white. And that was the last shot of the night for me. And that about does it. Now, I like to do what is called a parting shot. Railfan and Railroad Magazine ends all of their issues with a parting shot, and that's basically the last shot in their magazine issues. So this parting shot that I did for tonight's slideshow was taken at Steamtown National Historic Site, which is one of the railroad museums in Pennsylvania. It's located in Scranton, and this was taken during a night photo session last year. This is steam locomotive 759, which was staged on the turntable. It doesn't run anymore, but thanks to some pyrotechnics and some electrical work with the headlights and everything, we were able to make it look like it was under steam. And that's one of my friends there standing on the footboard, waving the lantern. And that's all, folks. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us again for the next program.